What's going on, folks? This is Matt here for Dark One Linux Tech and Gaming, where this is the fusion of Linux technology and gaming. And this video popped up on my feed, and I found it quite interesting because I always enjoy hearing people's stories about why they became a Linux user, switched to Linux, etc. Because the journey, path, and avenue and reasons we all switch or go to Linux is vastly different for each one of us. We all have different reasons for why we end up making that, commitment to switch or jump to switch, etc. So let's get into this particular person's story about why they switched to Linux. I'm not going to lie, I'm probably not going to have a whole lot to say on these because I just kind of let the story that they're telling kind of fold on its own.
Okay, fine. So here's my story of how I discovered Linux. It was around, 2010 or something. I was just starting to study at university, and basically everyone had Linux. I mean, everyone cool had Linux, and it was all around me. We were using it in the computer room as well, where I learned to program C and C++. But me, I was kind of a die-hard Windows user. I always had Windows, and just my father was also a programmer, and he was really a big .NET fan and really liked Windows. Maybe because he grew up with it, and I kind of did too. Like, the first Windows I had was 3.11, and yeah, I had no issues with that system. And so this was kind of my first contact. I think it was 2009, right? So that was my first contact with Linux after like the few times that I saw it in libraries, because it's kind of common for German libraries to use Linux because it's free, and the state always wants to save money on stuff. And so I associated Linux with these sun ray stations that were always super slow and buggy and just looked like crap. So I had never thought about using Linux. I just knew that I didn't want Mac, like, ever, because I had to work on a bunch of Macs and just jobs that I did on the side, like in advertising, and I was like, why are people using these computers? They don't even show you an error message before they crash, and then afterwards they pretend like nothing happened. That's just like a bad boyfriend. No. And then at some point I just used Debian a lot because I spent a lot of long days and nights in that computer room just doing my homework. Like, we had these 4-hour-long theoretical physics problem-solving classes on Friday afternoons. And after that, everyone would just go to the library and do more problems. Yeah, that was basically my life, because if you study physics, or at least at the university where I was at, it meant just basically giving up everything else, not having any spare time. I mean, maybe if you didn't work, but I just started spending a lot of time at the computer room, and there we had a Debian, and that is how I came into contact with that. But for some reason, I never really thought about installing a Linux on my own computer. It was just not that interesting to me, and I did everything that I needed to do on my Windows. And I used a lot of open source software already because I was cheap. And I also used to tweak Windows in a way, as in disable all the processes that spy on you as far as possible. So I wasn't a complete noob or something. I was just not into Linux for some reason. And then I remember I went to a CCC Congress, which was in Berlin. And then I watched a bunch of talks there on forensics and just different types of hacking stuff and politics as well. It was pretty cool, interesting. I had never been to an event like that before. And I just remember that I was super embarrassed about running a Windows on my ThinkPad. I had a ThinkPad by that time already because, I don't know, I think it won a design prize. And I was contemplating for a hot minute to buy an Apple computer, like a MacBook. I don't know, they weren't that great back then, but everyone was just telling me how long they would last, like the 7 hours of battery time, and nothing else could do that. And then I thought, like, well, ThinkPad can do, 4 to 5 hours, good enough for me. It's not like I'm going on a super long train ride and will not have a socket anywhere, because we have those in trains, so it doesn't matter. So I had a ThinkPad, which was a step in the right direction, I guess. I had an X200, and I bought that on some notebooks cheaper for students page. Yeah. And so I was running some Windows 7 on it. It was a bit slow. And then I went to this CCC event, and all the people, they were sitting in the basement drinking something called Club Mate and a lot of black coffee, I guess. And everyone was just sitting down there in the basement. Phones were forbidden, like you weren't allowed to take pictures of anyone, of course. And I remember just sitting at my laptop using a VPN so no script kiddie would like snatch my password, which was still pretty easy back then. And I don't know, I was just sitting there looking at all the other people with their computers while I was writing some little program, I don't know. And everyone was using Linux. Like, I mean, maybe 1 in 100 people would have a MacBook, but most people, if you were glossing over the computers, you could just see, oh, there's Linux on that. And I remember.
So I do find this interesting. Having gone to a few Linux conferences over the years, I think FOSSCon was probably the most oxymoronic place I've been as far as it relates to that, because you saw a lot of Macs. You saw a lot of Macs, and then you would hear, you know, things like a lot of people with like Facebook Messenger and all these other kind of apps that people, you wouldn't make the association that they would be running those, you know, at something like a FOSSCon or so. I do find the dichotomy interesting, I guess. So, because my experience with conventions like that is far different. So hearing this, where it's somebody with a Windows system and very rarely a Mac, is very interesting to hear. So this is what I mean when I say different stories and different avenues coming into Linux. So let's let her continue.
Remember, it was so stupid, but I was so super embarrassed about my Windows that I downloaded some Windows theme that made it look more like a Linux. And I think that was the point when I realized, okay, maybe I should just install a Linux. And the other point that was just as stupid that sold me on it was when I was working at my university, we had MacBooks, like Mac Minis and MacBooks for PhD students. So all the PhD students had to use Apple hardware, and everyone else too, like the whole chair just bought Macs for everyone at some point because they thought it would be less maintenance, which turned out to be completely false. And I don't know, just like they wanted to save money on administration, and in the end they didn't, and they looked like total idiots, because what decent physicist works on a Mac? That is a disgrace to the field. But as I was working with these Mac Minis myself, which by the way went up in flames as soon as you opened more than 5 tabs in Firefox, I found that you had this violet transparent terminal on Mac, and I thought it was cool, and I thought like, oh, this is the only cool thing Mac has actually to offer. I like that. I want a transparent terminal too. And then I basically found out that you could do anything in the terminal, and that you could make your terminal look like whatever you want, you know, the terminal emulator, not the TDY. But yeah, then a bunch of times I would just hang out with other IT people, computer science students, other physicists, and everyone would use Linux. And at some point I would just observe cool things you could do on Linux that you could not do on Windows, as in, for instance, pressing Alt and the left mouse button and just move a window around everywhere, or just multiple workspaces, which back in the day were a pain in the ass, like just the multiple desktops that you would have in Windows, and I still think they're not good. So back then they were either non-existent or really bad, or you had to use some weird software. So it was annoying. It was just.
So for those that don't know, I can't remember I have a video on my channel, and I don't remember the name of the actual app because it's been so long since I've used it, because it was back in the XP days. But essentially, it created virtual workspaces for Windows versions. Hacky, laggy, didn't matter how powerful your system was, and you could tell Windows just wasn't built for it. So I think this is what a lot of people come to the realization is: there's certain things that you fight with that you just don't want to fight with. And this is a workflow thing, and I've talked a little bit about this, like workflow stuff. And really, it does boil down to how you interact with computing and all that stuff. Windows and Mac are very much a one-size-fits-all. What you see is what you get. And you have very limited options about how you can change it or interact with it. Linux is 180 degrees on the opposite direction. And that can be a bit overwhelming for some. And justifiably so, because of where you're coming from. She had mentioned about using some open source stuff prior already, so that is another avenue of easing the switch to Linux from, say, Mac OS or Windows. So thus far, I'm really enjoying the story, so I really don't have a ton to say here, but I definitely get what she's talking about, and like how I'll be the first to say, I still have a Windows system that is mostly because Linux doesn't play nice on the 4K screen more than anything else. But really, it boils down to doing virtual desktops and stuff on Windows is kind of crap. Like, you have a 3070 Ti on this machine, and there's jank when you do a 3-finger swipe on the touchpad. Like, give me a break. So that, like, there's certain things where Windows has a lot of areas that still needs to improve on it. And don't get me wrong, Linux has its flaws and everything else. Like, every OS has, to quote 3 Dead Trolls in a Bag, every OS sucks. It's just which one sucks less for you. So, again, thus far, I really don't have a lot to add to this. I'm just really enjoying the story, and there are reasons what works for them, what doesn't. Because, again, PC, personal computing. What's your personal computing preference? For her, or for them, it's, Linux. For me, it's Linux. I use the other ones because I talk about the other things. I don't use them because I like them. Very big difference. So, let's continue the story, shall we?
Just all these little things that sold me on Linux, and I just got some live stick with Ubuntu on it and installed it. It was not that hard, and I figured, okay, I can work with this. It's not difficult to find out how stuff works in the terminal. I like the terminal better than all this GUI shit anyway, so I'm just going to continue to use the terminal. And
I will disagree. I will disagree with that particular take. Terminal versus GUI depends on the user. That's all. Like, if you view computers as a tool, most people are just going to use the fucking GUI. If you're using the computer as a tool, these are different kind of avenues. If you're using the computer as a tool, you will want to be the most efficient. Key difference. How you interact with the computer is what kind of iterates that key difference. So, I'm a GUI guy. I know how to use the terminal. I'm not afraid of the terminal. But I also don't have a problem pointing out that Linux tends to have a really big over-reliance on it.
And be happy. And I don't know, I tried everything in my 10 plus years of Linux. Tried all sorts of window managers, tile window managers. At some point, I entirely just did everything in the TTY using VI or what do the cool kids use now? Vim. Yeah, I did everything using that. E-links and other text-based browsers, and my university also had Awesome installed on the computer, so used that as well. And then at some point I just graduated to Ubuntu because I really like the XFCE desktop and just the whole look and feel of the X sessions. I just like it better than GNOME. Also, at some point, this Unity shit came out on Ubuntu, and I just really didn't want to use that. I found it ugly, and this whole glossy, oh, you can use it on a tablet thing wasn't for me. So I basically wanted something that looked like the old GNOME shell. But I also wanted something that looked kind of 90s, kind of a little bit like my first Windows, like old and weird and vintage, I guess. And so, yeah, that was kind of part of the decisions. Like,
again, this is a workflow thing. I was just talking about aesthetics, but like for a lot of people, this kind of shit matters. So, like, personally, I'm a Unity guy. Always have been. I'm a Plasma user now because Unity's around, but it's not around. I'll leave it at that. But I totally get why people will use something over something else, because again, it flips back to workflow and what's the most productive way for you to do and interact with your computer, your personal computing. That's really what it boils down to. So again, I don't view Unity as shit. I view the first iteration of Unity that was forced out the door way too early as shit. But from 12.04 onward, it was decent. It was stable for the most part. Excuse me. And I didn't have a personal problem with it. I actually liked the aesthetic. The colors could have been a little bit different. And Canonical dropped the ball a lot on certain things when it came to Unity that the community still complains about 10 years later. So I get it. And that is the perk of something like Linux, where it is not a force-fed option from a GUI to a terminal to applications to, you know, whatever. It's your personal computing choice at the end of the day. As somebody that I know likes to say, Linux puts the personal back in personal computing.
I'm absolutely aware that a lot of aesthetics are involved in my Linux distro finding process, but I mean, at least I can say I never did much distro hopping because I just went straight from Ubuntu to Xubuntu. I had Lubuntu on some other old super slow machine, and I also had Mint on another slow machine that I left at the university because they didn't have laptops there. And so I brought my own, which was like super old. It was from my husband, he didn't need it anymore, so I brought that thing there because I wouldn't mind if someone spilled beer on it, right? So I didn't want to bring my precious little X200 with the docking station and everything. I didn't want to bring that to a place where it's possible that beer flows on keyboards. No. Like, we had a fridge in the room where I wrote my bachelor's thesis, and the fridge smelled horror awful. So yeah, and then at some point I was just like, okay, I think I want to use Arch Linux. And I installed Arch Linux, and I used it for like a year or two, but I really didn't like the repository. I was missing a lot of things, and at some point I was just thinking, why not go back to Ubuntu? But then I thought, any Ubuntu, like Ubuntu, Lubuntu, whatever, they're all kind of slow and bloated, and I don't know, what can I do? What can I do? What's the next bigger branch? Where does this actually come from? Oh, Debian! Oh, okay, let's install Debian. And we've lived happily ever after. The end. So here's my story of how I dix Xubuntu or Xubuntu, right? How's it pronounced? And it was all.
So generally, I don't have any complaints about the story. You know, for those that want some wrestling quotes and stuff, you know, it was story time, but not with Adam Cole, baby, as it was. So I totally get what they're talking about, and distros is preference. It really is. I'm not gonna. I've already said my piece about what I think about. Oh, distros don't matter and all the other crap. I'm not going to get into that. But the overall story and the history and the reasons why for a person to switch are so important. And to hear from somebody else's perspective and reason why they made that switch is fairly interesting. And, you know, so, you know, you're going to hear somebody say, oh, well, you can find everything in art user repositories, etc., etc. Maybe it's not what she needed. That's what it boils down to. And that's perfectly fine. So I'm not going to slag on somebody for not using Arch. I mean, I still have Ubuntu machines. I have, actually my Atari VCS runs Debian. So it's all relative to what you're using at the end of the day. So, as long as you're happy with your distro of choice and it allows you to do your computing, then you chose the best personal computing option for you. And I enjoyed the story. Thanks for hearing it. Love hearing Linux users and the reasons they came to it. And best Windows, still 3.1. Other than that, I will catch you guys in the next one. You guys know what to do. Comment, rate, subscribe, all that fun jazz. And Indie Gala, Patreon, all that stuff is down below. Peace.